They say singing can help you remember things, so here's some tips for parents out there during these tough times.
Number 1.
Make sure your kids wash their hands for 20 seconds after they've coughed or sneezed or been outside.
2.
Virtual play dates, social and physical distancing can help save lives.
3.
Tell them they're safe and show your love and pride. Yes, we'll get through this together. Find out more at coronavirus.gov. A message from the CDC and the Ad Council.
A picture-perfect day in Rochester, New York for the 2011 WPS Championship game presented by Citi. West New York Flash taking on the Philadelphia Independents. Welcome, everybody, to the WPS Championship game presented by Citi on FSN. Alan Hopkins alongside Jen Hildreth. So glad you could join us, and we couldn't ask for anything more in this championship game. And we begin with the West New York Flash, who have two of the better players in the entire world in Marta and Christine Sinclair.
We only talk about league MVP candidates in this open here. That's the luxury we have. We'll start with Marta, the player who won it the previous 2 years and who has come on down the stretch for Western New York. 5 goals in the last 3 matches. She's really heating up. Meanwhile, Christine Sinclair, I think, has been the most consistent player in the league this season. Tied for the lead in scoring with 10 goals with her teammate Marta. She can do it all for Western New York, and she usually does.
And for the Philadelphia Independents, their MVP, Veronica Bocchetti.
Well, she won an awful lot of votes as the season went on because she was simply clutch for Philadelphia. They wouldn't be here without her, no question about that. She finds a way to score goals when nobody else is able to, and you can bet she is the playmaker Philadelphia will be looking for in this match today.
Going up against her former coach in the championship game, another interesting storyline. When we come back, starting lineups and the kickoff for the 2011 WPS Championship game presented by Citi on FSN. Stay with us.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, greetings and salutations, friends. How you doing? My name is Tim Hanlon, and of course, you have found Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that's devoted to all things that used to be in professional sports. Thanks for coming by. And we're going back to soccer today, and frankly, an overdue relook at the women's professional game. Something we scratched the surface of way back in episode number 2 with our pal Andy Crossley, he of the old Boston Breakers franchise of women's professional soccer, the WPS, if you will. And that is one of the topics, the women's professional soccer extravaganza that was back in the day, not too long ago, back in 2008 through 2011 or so, actually 2012, if you're historically checking. That's when the league, the second really major attempt at women's professional soccer, kind of ended its relatively short 3-season life. The clip that you just heard, perhaps a little bit of, I don't know if it was ominous. I don't think many people in the stands in Rochester on August 27th, 2011, as the Western New York Flash, led by Marta, defeated the Philadelphia Independents, led by league MVP Veronica Bocchetti. That day, I don't think anybody really kind of knew that that was going to be the last ever game of women's professional soccer. The league itself going on hiatus in January of 2012 and calling it officially kaput in May of 2012. But as most soccer fans, and certainly women's soccer fans, know, that was a dark day, and perhaps the second punch to the gut if you were a fan of women's professional soccer, that women's professional, not only the league, but women's quote unquote professional soccer generally, right? Because as you may remember, the old Women's United Soccer Association, the WUSA, right, was the first real attempt and splashy and well-funded at that back in 2000, itself folding after only 3 seasons with lots of money, lots of television coverage, and arguably lots of spending on high-quality, world-class players, and maybe some lack of guardrails, shall we say, on that spending. But here we are as we dial up our conversation this week with our special guest, Beau Dure, probably the most well-knowledged, if that's a term. Sure, it is for this case, for this podcast. Why not? In the realm and the specific genre, if you will, of women's professional soccer in this country. And this is against the backdrop, the women's professional game, the WUSA and the WPS, of now almost 30 years of world championship caliber play of the United States women's team in not only the World Cups of that era, but also, of course, various women's Olympic game glory, winning gold medals along the way. Many, many championships, both at the World Cup level and at the Olympic level. The United States women's team over that period of time has been, without question, over that period of time, the world's best team. Not winning everything every single time, but dominant is probably the best word to describe just how successful the U.S. women's national team has been. And no question, the drafting of such to create successful women's leagues. And two strikes against that sort of approach, that enterprise in the WUSA and the WPS. We get into that with Beau in our conversation, but as you'll hear, we sort of center around the year of 2012 when women's professional soccer, the WPS, did indeed call it quits. You could have argued and imagined that not unlike followers of men's professional soccer in this country back in the mid-'80s, it was maybe yet another sign, a dark sign, that this professional approach for the women's game may just not take root and not hold and just be a forever pipe dream. And around that year, 2012, is when, as we get into our conversation, you'll hear from the ashes rose for yet a third time, perhaps against all the odds, what now is the longest lasting and just about thriving. Now, COVID-19 notwithstanding, because it's obviously a challenge to all pro sports in this country right now, across the world too. But the National Women's Soccer League, the NWSL, timely as today's headlines, just last week, announcing a new franchise, a new expansion franchise to be funded from venture capital. Mia Hamm is part of the ownership group. She, of course, part of the LAFC ownership group and MLS, and a bunch of Hollywood luminaries as well participating in that. And if you've been paying attention, the NWSL, quite successful in places like Portland, domiciling and sharing resources with the Portland Timbers of MLS, for example, was the first professional league to come back after this initial bout of COVID-19 craziness, and is still playing as we record this in their bubble in Utah as they determine a Challenge Cup winner for this season. But the NWSL really was forged out of the doings of 2012 as we get into that background story. And it's intriguing for sure, because I think many people would have imagined that women's pro soccer was at the end of WPS kind of a lost cause. And indeed, through the efforts of an indefatigable bunch of people, including, by the way, U.S. Soccer, which sounds ironic given the testiness now between the women's national team players and U.S. Soccer, the federation, around equal pay and all of that. In 2012, if not for U.S. Soccer, I think, frankly, a lot of the foundational elements of what is now a successful and just about now thriving NWSL probably would not have occurred. And we get into that and a whole bunch of things as we talk about women's professional soccer, the leagues of the WUSA, WPS, and now the ongoing and bright sky lit NWSL with our guest this week, Beau Dure. And it's a fascinating conversation and unlocks another sort of set of Pandora's boxes, if you will, about lots of other things that we want to explore. We talk about Magic Jack, that curious little franchise that kind of relocated from Washington down to Florida. We talk about for a bit of time the Bay Area Cyber Rays, perhaps the most inelegantly named pro franchise in modern history. We talk about the past and the present, and certainly the future of the NWSL. And it's fascinating stuff. And it's all coming up in just a few moments' time with Beau. Stay tuned for that. Before we get there, we want to tip our cap of admiration to our friends at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Our pal Dean Mitchell and friends in San Diego. We tout them again, especially because if you're looking for some WUSA or WPS memorabilia, guess what? Sportshistorycollectibles.com is the place to go. You're going to find a whole bunch of stuff. For example, if you fancied yourself a fan or remember yourself as a fan of the WUSA's San Diego Spirit, one of the original franchises, actually most of them were original, and it lasted for all 3 seasons. The San Diego Spirit are memorialized in great stuff. There's some bumper stickers there. They're ticket brochures. You want a Spirit patch. You want a program pack of all the unique and different programs from their various seasons. There's a WUSA bumper sticker in the mix, a couple of media guides too, some schedules, all those kinds of things for the San Diego Spirit of the old WUSA. You'll find those at the website sportshistorycollectibles.com. You could also find some great memorabilia from women's professional soccer, WPS too, there, as well as a whole host of not only soccer stuff from leagues all over the place, but also from all kinds of leagues and team situations no longer with us for whatever reasons. If, of course, as you dally around that site and you find some great stuff that you're interested in, well, hey, we've got a promo code for you there. Of course, Good Seats. The promo code is, again, Good Seats at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Yes, I just get excited just talking about it because it's 15% off all of your purchases when you go there early and often and use that promo code. We thank Dean. We thank our friends at Good Seats still available. I'm thanking myself, which is just nuts. But I do want to thank sportshistorycollectibles.com and Dean in particular for their long-lasting sponsorship of the show, the discount they extend to our great listeners. And we hope that you enjoy that discount now and ongoing, as well as the proceedings we have for you this week. Here's our chat coming up now with Beau Dure as we talk about the women's professional soccer game in this country, the last 20 years or so, and the blue sky ahead with the NWSL. Here's our conversation we had just last week. Please, as always, enjoy. What is your professional and personal story, and how is soccer part of your life? Because I know, you've been or still are very much a professional writer / journalist beyond maybe an unwitting historian, but give our audience a sense of your background to get us going, will you?
Well, like a lot of Gen X people, my first exposure to the sport was Soccer Made in Germany on PBS with the great Toby Charles, giving us hour-long
We have to
highlights.
hear your Toby Charles imitation, don't we?
Oh, it's been a while. I seem to remember him just saying Beckenbauer over and over again, and Borussia Mönchengladbach. It's just the words. The words just grab, someone of my age. And then I played youth soccer in the early stages of what we call travel soccer. Was in Athens, Georgia, and so we go to Atlanta and get absolutely destroyed. And then I kind of lost touch. I didn't play in high school. I was a runner instead. In college, I went to some games at Duke. I was there when the women's soccer program started at Duke. So I wrote about it a little bit. I was never really a sports writer, though, for a lot of my career, both in college and then professionally when I went pro. But it was something I just kind of dabbled in. I would write sports columns occasionally while I had other jobs at my first 2 papers. Then in 1998, I moved to Knight Ridder Tribune in D.C., and I was bored, so I started writing a soccer column and carried it over when I went to USA Today and wound up in the USA Today sports department. And, I was never officially a soccer writer. Officially, USA Today hasn't had a soccer writer since 2000 when Peter Brewington left. So I had soccer on top of various other things. I was sort of like the sports data guinea pig, the sports chat guinea pig. Everybody thought I had technical skills that I didn't really have. And then I I did a lot of Olympics work, went to 4 Olympics, only one of them covering soccer. Well, 3 of them were Winter Olympics. They have not added soccer to the Winter Olympics yet. That would be a problem. And then USA Today's first MMA beat writer. And then I left in 2010 for more family time, so I could, see my kids on weekends. I wound up coaching all their games, and I've wrote a short book about that called Single Digit Soccer. And then I anticipated writing about a bunch of stuff, but soccer always won out. ESPN sent me to the Women's World Cup. I did a lot of work for them on women's soccer. And I've just stayed with it for whichever sites are still functioning. There was FOTS, and they stopped using writers. 442 had a U.S. operation, and that. So when you're a freelancer, things tend to be very tenuous. But so now I'm doing a lot of Soccer America. I'm kind of on hiatus from NBC. I was doing Olympics work for them, and there's no Olympics this year, so that's kind of on the back burner right now, and write some for The Guardian.
Well, so I mean that's interesting, because it sounds like you almost, I don't want to put words in your mouth, almost fell in, I guess, to the sort of soccer beat, as it were, right? Which, if that's correct, is actually not too far a stretch from some of the other stories that we've heard, especially on the broadcasting side, right? Where, they were either, it wasn't sort of like the first thing or even the second or third thing on people's sort of radar as to what to pursue, but maybe not unlike your digital expertise foist upon you. I remember in my crazy career in advertising and marketing and media, right? But back in the 90s, the person who had an AOL account became kind of the de facto tech person, right? Because, right. So and it was more born out of just enthusiasm or some passion or interest, and it just sort of became sort of a discovered go-to when the need presented itself.
Yeah, I'm not the only journalist who has that story. I think you find that Stephen Goff may have been the same way to some extent. I can't speak directly for him, but I think that's roughly how I understand it. Grant Wall wasn't initially a full-time soccer writer at Sports Illustrated, and I think a lot of people just were hired to do one thing and just started nagging people that hey, we need soccer content, and they're like, okay, well, shut up, and unless you want to do it. Well, okay, I'll do it. So that's I think that's a fairly common story for people of my generation in journalism. So there were certainly a lot of people who think that soccer writer is this job, and it's really not. I mean, there are only a handful of people I can think of who made a full-time living out of that over the years. I mean, Michael Lewis being perhaps the biggest of them. But yeah, most, and then a few people for Soccer America as well. But this notion of soccer being the only thing that you do in journalism is pretty recent in this country, at least.
Yeah, and even that relatively new, right? For whatever reasons, let's call it MLS perhaps, and the influx and or the media abundance now of games from all over the world, as well as MLS's efforts on the Foxes and the ESPNs of the world. But I think it's interesting too, because a lot of your experiences of late came sort of in the DC metro area. Now, I went to college there. It's always been kind of a I'm going to call it a soccer hotbed, but it's always been a bit more, maybe, I guess, shall we say, advanced in terms of its embrace of the professional game. That dates back all the way to the 60s and maybe even a little bit earlier. But you, in some respects, you're almost in a fertile territory there, certainly participatory, but I would argue also professionally, which also not only extends on the men's side, but also into the fledgling and still fledgling women's game, no?
Yeah, well, it's certainly an international community. And when I first moved up here around 98, I mean, I had heard of this soccer bar called Summers, and I thought, wow, what a fascinating concept to have a place where people just go watch soccer constantly. I mean, there was a bar when I lived in Greensboro, North Carolina, that would show back in the day when if you wanted to see a Premier League game, you had to go someplace and pay $10 to see it. But went to Summers a lot in my early days up here, and I remember going 2 days on the same weekend. I went Saturday and Sunday, and one day was an FA Cup game, and another day was an African Cup of Nations game, I believe. And so I was there both days. It was packed both days, and I was probably the only person who was there both days. So it was two different crowds that came in and packed the place. Yeah, and that. So yeah, there's always been a good fan base here. DC United did fairly well for a long time, I think, but then RFK Stadium became sort of an albatross. So they've kind of been reborn. Now they've been to Audi Field. The Washington Freedom were kind of the flagship of WUSA and a good WPS team. And, the Freedom stayed alive. And this is mentioned in my book because I compare that dark age of 2004 to 2008, where there was no professional league, but the Washington Freedom continued to exist that entire time. They played an exhibition schedule for a couple of years, and then they entered the W League, which is amateur, and they were all amateurs at that point, and then continued on to WPS. So Washington. It was a shame that 2011 was actually the only year I can think of that Washington didn't have a team in what you would probably call the top flight. 2012, it's debatable, but they've always done pretty well. I mean, they're currently playing way out in the exurbs, the Maryland Soccer Pledge. I think the Spirit, when they start playing more games at Audi Field, they're going to have a pretty good chance to, climb the attendance chart in the league.
All right. So give me a sense then of, as I said, I went to college in D.C. I remember you're talking about sort of the dark ages. I even remember the dark ages, frankly, of the men's pro game, right, which is sort of a circa 1985 and beyond. I remember back when Channel 53, WNVT down there in Northern Virginia, was a second or third tier PBS station. It was almost like the locus for international matches. It was like the place where an abundance actually of games from all over the world. And it was sort of a great little secret. But to your point earlier, not much of a secret, right? Because this was an audience full of expats, people who are transient and from other parts of the globe, frankly, and the DC sort of melting pot, I guess, of ethnicities and, frankly, a love commonly of the game of soccer, regardless of who's playing it.
Yeah, when I moved up here in '98, and I remember seeing that there was more soccer on television than I realized existed, because there were a couple of just little channels here and there that picked up games from various places, and so that was a nice supplement to what was then probably just like the Monday night Premier League game on ESPN, which for a while was the only thing you could see free, which was they would, whatever game that's played Monday evening in England, so Monday afternoon our time, they would show it. I remember when it used to be a pretty big thing on message boards that if you were going to discuss a game that you were seeing, that you had to put like a spoiler alert in there, because so many people were going to watch it later because that was the only time they had the opportunity to do so. Now, I mean, theoretically, if you're at work, that might still be the case, and you may not be watching a Champions League game in the afternoon. But there's so many ways to follow those games as they happen now that people don't do that. But that's that was the reality for soccer fandom for a long time. And DC, there were channels, just sort of these offbeat, independent channels that catered toward world programming. And that's where you get that stuff.
So how do you get dragged into covering the game then? I mean, a little bit of sort of a sense of how much of this is your sort of pushing the story in front of your editors, even though you're not sort of hired or have been hired to kind of do that kind of stuff. And how do you also, arguably that would be a challenge for the men's pro game in the late 90s, early aughts, right? Given that Major League Soccer was only a few years under its belt and not still mainstream, although I would argue the Washington Post in Washington maybe being at that time an exception relative to the rest of the country at that time. But then probably the harder, I would imagine, boulder to push up the mountain around the women's game, which was, barely, beyond the occasional quadrennial tournament and noticed by more than just a niche of passionate fans, in relatively small numbers.
Yeah, in 1999, when I was at Knight Ridder Tribune, we were having a meeting to discuss things that we could do special coverage for. And there was a kid who was about, I say kid, I mean, he was someone about my age and had picked some sort of weird rivalry with me because, he went to Penn and I went to Duke, and he kept telling me that, Duke was for Ivy League rejects and so forth. And I would point to the U.S. News rankings where we were higher than Penn. And so that, he always kind of sniped at me about this and that. And in this meeting, I said, well, we should probably do something for the World Cup this summer. And he's like, what's that? And I said, it's the Women's World Cup. It's going to be here, soccer. And he said, people in this country don't care about soccer at all, much less women's soccer. So it's nice to be right about that one. and I wrote, at the time, I was basically just writing sort of a weekly MLS column, just, putting it out when I was kind of bored at work because there wasn't a lot to do there. It was just a weird kind of job where you had a couple of dead hours during each shift. And so then when I went to USA Today, I said, well, I'm writing a column. I'd really like to keep doing this. And USA Today was laid back enough at the time that you could do that sort of thing. Of course, a lot of people did. I mean, you mentioned the Washington Post. I remember there was a guy named Alex Johnson who did a soccer column that was exclusive online content, which in those days was revolutionary, just to have something that appeared online only. And so you get away with doing stuff like that. And there were a lot of cases from then on where I was just I was writing my column, which had a little bit of a following. And then there was kind of a divide between the print and online staffs at that point. I mean, I think there were some print people who sort of were waiting for this whole internet thing to go away. And so they weren't really aware. Well, some of them didn't quite know that, I had established this voice online, but some of them did. And then after a while, we eventually merged the staffs. And so, at that point, I was pretty much the soccer guy, although we had other people who'd go too, like Kelly Whiteside was someone who covered college sports mostly, but, she had played collegiately. And so she tended to pop in when there were big events going on as well.
So 99, obviously a watershed moment in the Women's World Cup, right? It's something that the United States had, in somewhat quiet terms, had kind of established themselves as being, well, they won the first ever one in 91, right? And were still competitive in that process. And then obviously having it based in the United States. So, when did you know, I mean, after successfully pitching this, I mean, when did you get the sense that you were quote unquote right? And when did you kind of as a journalist sort of get the inkling that the success, the building success, the ultimate success of this tournament and the U.S. team would translate into something that just a few years earlier would have been looked upon as a gigantic pipe dream, that is an honest to goodness professional women's league?
Yeah, I thought that I think there were reports fairly early on that ticket sales were going a lot better than expected. And certainly by the time you got to the opening game and saw the U.S. In there, it was a pretty big deal. And, to some extent, I felt like I was right already because, I went to the 1996 Olympic final, which was in my hometown, Athens, Georgia. It was, I had played, youth football on that field, before a University of Georgia football game. And that was, it was a big crowd. It almost sold out, one of the largest football stadiums in the country. So
they even moved the hedges, didn't they, for that?
They did.
I was at a bunch of those games. I was almost exclusively at both of those tournaments as my Olympic experience down there. But But yeah, I mean, that was, I guess that's an unfair question asking about 99 World Cup as a watershed, because in many respects you could have made the argument, and I guess you're kind of maybe doing it, is the 96 Olympics was a true women's breakout too. And maybe the first time, aside from the soccer nerds that, knew what 91 was all about, that this was something maybe, more dynamite that could be blown up and exploited later on beyond that.
Yeah, well, no, 96, the TV impact was limited because, that's the thing about the Olympics. There's always so much going on. And, it's very big when you're there. I mean, I've talked with people after the fact about the 2008 Olympic final that I covered, which I thought the U.S. was bound to lose. They're playing Brazil. Brazil had just absolutely crushed them the year before. And I thought they had no chance of winning this final, but they had a heroic defensive effort. And then, Carly Lloyd scored the extra time goal. But then people told me after the fact, well, it was in another time zone and it didn't have a lot of TV coverage because it was during the Olympics. So it didn't really resonate quite as well. And so 99, I mean, first of all, in the summers, it is kind of a dead spot for sports. It's where something off the wall can take hold. It's why, we all cared about the Tour de France for, a decade and change. There wasn't much else going on. And here was this American who was really good at it. And, that's the kind of the same way it was for women's soccer in those days. And it was unfortunate that people really overstated, how to translate that to a professional game. And they didn't understand that Americans love the big event. And it hasn't always translated. I mean, Americans would watch the World Cup on TV if you said, "Hey, it's on." Hey, well, it's okay. This is interesting. It's a big deal. I mean, to some extent, that was the appeal of the NASL with the Cosmos. It was, hey, this is a big event. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in there was going to then turn around and get really immersed in the game the way we expect people to do so these days. The way you see people in this country who is just watching the Premier League game this afternoon and seeing, Liverpool fans at an online watch party, or, you may have MLS fans gathered in a bar to watch an away game. Well, not right now because of social distancing, but and you have people who really make fandom a fairly big part of what they do. And so that took a long, long time to build. And I think there have been a lot of mistakes both on the men's and women's side in thinking that, we've just had this World Cup, so it's going to translate. Eventually it does. And that's why it's disappointing for women's soccer that they haven't had a chance to play a full season this year, because it felt different in 2019. There have been boom times before. I mean, 2015 was a big time for 2011 was a big time for women's soccer. And, those booms didn't last. This one just really felt, and to some extent still feels, different.
Yeah, so, I mean, we're going to sort of get to where we kind of are now, that NWSL and the thing that preceded it, which is a lot of the focus of your book around the 2012 year in women's soccer. But I think it's important for our audience, especially those not sort of deeply steeped in the once, twice, three times a lady, no pun, but maybe a pun, right, of the professional league for women in this country, right? The first one, I mean, you're talking about 99 being, obviously just an unparalleled success financially as well as on the field, and just all of the cultural momentum that the victory of the women's team had in this country, right? And you could not have probably scripted a better set of circumstances to launch a WUSA with splash, with panache, with money, with a big backer like John Hendricks and all that stuff, right? But in 3 years, it was, done kaput. And again, and arguably in the backdrop of MLS struggling and a financial downturn and a different time in this country back even in 2001 when, the attacks on in New York and D.C. and in Pennsylvania. I mean, it was clearly some broader issues at stake there too. But it didn't sort of kill the women's game, right? Because it still continued to be quite the success in terms of rebuilding, in terms of performances generally in and around these major competitions. Not always winning, but generally regarded as the team to beat in any stretch of the imagination. And then the sort of seeds of a second attempt. So maybe, I know there's sort of a lot to unpack there, but maybe you could kind of just in a layman's kind of way, sort of maybe describe a little bit of the zeitgeist of the WUSA, the sort of denouement of that, and then from the ashes, this women's professional soccer second attempt, because I think that's really important background for what we're going to kind of get into, because it's really the post-WPS stuff that is really the center of your work here.
Well, the WUSA, if you go back and look at attendance numbers and so forth, you'd think, wow, this league actually did pretty well. The problem was they spent an awful lot of money to get there, and a lot of it was predicated on the idea that they were going to get massive ratings. And when that didn't materialize, a lot of people just kind of bailed, and then all of a sudden games were on PAX network at 4 p.m. and opposite MLS at one point. So you had your national WUSA game of the week on an obscure network where they had to wrap up hard stop at 6 o'clock because they got to show Bonanza or whatever. So it was really not too much of a surprise that it went away. And then they played a couple of exhibitions the next year, thinking, oh, we're just doing a hiatus. We're going to come back. And we'll build off the momentum from the Olympics. And of course, the Olympics that year were when the 99ers, or a lot of them, went out with a bang. They won another Olympic gold. And my memory of that is basically, and I didn't see much of the games because, too much. There's so much going on at the Olympics. I didn't go to Athens because I had a newborn at home, and so I was working in the office and following things remotely from beautiful Tyson's Corner. But I remember the medal stand and seeing Mia Hamm and Julie Foudy singing as going out as winners. And then there was just nothing. If you look at women's soccer attendance for the national team games that year, I mean, you will see a lot of depressing numbers, a lot of, four figures, sometimes low four figures. The only attention they got in those days was ESPN that had something called Page 2 at that point, and they ran these, hottest athlete polls, and Heather Mitts always did really well in them, and she'd end up on magazine covers and so forth, and that was pretty much it. And the best player was Abby Wambach, and people kind of knew who she was, but not really. And then it jumped back into the spotlight in 2007 when they got blasted by Brazil, and Hope Solo gave the infamous interview afterwards, saying, she had been benched for Brea Scurry. And the reasoning they gave at the time was that they thought Scurry was going to thought Scurry had some sort of advantage against Brazil. The truth is, without a professional league, and this shows you one reason why professional leagues are so important, Scurry had barely played any competitive games in the 3 years preceding. And so there were reasons, kind of murky reasons, off-field reasons why Hope Solo was benched in that. And then, she gave that interview after they got routed by Brazil saying, I would have made those saves when, at most she would have made two of them. I mean, they were played off the pitch that day. She would not have made a difference in the long run. And then that was the publicity women's soccer got. And really, 2000. Yeah, go ahead. You're now describing, obviously,
arguably you could not have gotten a bigger burst of investment and excitement to get a league going, and for various reasons that you described, especially the unfettered spending, shall we say, on lots of different things, right? And then boom, it collapses in 3 years. In some respects, it's almost a repeat of some of the travails that the men went through, say, in the 1980s, early 90s, right? Because I would imagine as a women's soccer enthusiast, professionally, amateur, just overall the U.S. national team, et cetera, and I'm sure there's a generation of largely girls, but not exclusively, that, kind of felt like a lot of young guys like myself back in the old NASL days when that went kaput, that they had been abandoned in some respects, right? The pinnacle, the great tournament, the memories, probably went to a bunch of games. You wanted to support your team. You saw it on television, and all of a sudden, it's gone. I mean, it had to be just short of depressing and or almost abandonment for everybody involved, fan, player, administrator, investors, for sure.
Yeah, I think so. And of course, post September 11th and with the economic downturn after that, I mean, men's soccer nearly went out again. I mean, the U.S. was fairly close to going into 2002 with a professional women's league and not a professional men's league. But, it was, I don't think that would have helped WUSA to have the men's league go. It was just a difficult time and a bit too much exuberance. And so, it was just that their metrics were too high. They were just expecting this to be so much more than it was, and not realizing that you can't just build everything off of one thing. I mean, there's a reason you don't see, a massive explosion in professional volleyball or water polo after the Olympics. There's just so much more to be done.
But what I didn't know, and we're getting to the exclamation point of the story, I promise. What I didn't recognize until fairly recently doing research for this conversation was that WPS, Women's Professional Soccer, which basically brought top tier the women's game for a second run starting in 2009, actually truly had direct seeds from the remnants of the WUSA. I thought it was completely separate and or just another attempt with a sort of a different set of approaches. But it does seem to me like there was some persistent, attempt to sort of keep whatever pieces that were sort of left behind of WUSA kind of alive and going, and maybe to kind of get those embers to catch again. Is that your recollection and or your understanding of WPS's creation and rise too?
Well, there was a little bit of continuity. Tanya Antonucci, who was essentially the founding commissioner of WPS, had come out through sort of a WUSA, revived WUSA initiative. And of course, you still had the Hendricks family. You mentioned that they were still, they were people who really founded the WUSA, and they kept the Washington Freedom going all those years. And the Washington Freedom went right back into WPS. But it really was very different. And some of the one of the things that changed was that in the WUSA, you had the best players from everywhere in the world. I mean, the top 5 German players were all in the WUSA. China was difficult, but at least one season they got Sun Wen. They got the 5. They got most. They got almost every international player that they wanted, except for Hanna Ljungberg in Sweden. WPS was so much more modest than that. I mean, the Freedom were playing at the Maryland Soccerplex with some bleachers added on instead of playing at RFK Stadium. It was more managed expectations. They weren't going to get the big names over. Of course, European women's soccer was building up as well. So to me, it was a different sort of entity, and also it was one that didn't have a particularly strong central office. I mean, I don't mean that it wasn't strong in the sense that the people weren't qualified. They certainly were. It wasn't strong in the sense that they just didn't build up that central office, and that led to some problems. I don't think the WUSA would have had a situation. We've had situations like you had with WPS, where after the first season they hold the draft for the second season, and then one of the championship team, the Los Angeles Sol, folds immediately after that. Then you get a few games into the next season, And then you find out that St. Louis Athletica has been propped up by these investors that no one knew about, and they suddenly stopped writing checks, and that team folds partway into the season, which you'd expect from kind of, one of those indoor leagues that didn't really gain any traction in, I guess, the 2000s or so.
So by comparison, though, right, the financial, right, obviously they were much less, I guess, solid, but I argue that was a complete 180 from the learned from experiences of the WUSA, almost maybe to a fault, where they were being more modest and not recognizing that the some expense on some of the better players and maybe a few more credit checks on some of the owners.
Right.
No.
Yeah, it wasn't. But you still had the fact that people were spending a lot of money specifically on MARTA. You had to have MARTA, and so, but then you'd get MARTA, win a championship, and then fold. That's just how it went. And they didn't have. I don't know that they had any sort of salary cap. I don't because the Washington Freedom were sold to Dan Borislow, who moved the team down to South Florida, named it Magic Jack after one of the gizmos that he invented, and bought up a ton of talent. I mean, just had almost like 2/3 of the players you would think of as the U.S. national team there. And the Western New York Flash also spent pretty heavily, and they had MARTA and a lot of good international players. And you had the teams were all pretty good because there were only 6 of them, and there's a lot of talent to go around. But it was just erratic spending. You'd have a couple of people spending a ton of money. In Magic Jack's case, they were spending a ton of money on the players and making them comfortable in nice condos and so forth, and then spending almost literally nothing on marketing. And people didn't. There were good reporters, good soccer writers in the Miami area or in South Florida who didn't know that there was this team forming in their backyards with Abby Wambach and Christy Rampone and Hope Solo. They didn't know because no one had told them. And it was only when, some of us who had been following the Washington Freedom and were saying, well, wait a minute, where are they going to play? It was when it became apparent that they were going to go to South Florida. It was only then that, we started to alert them saying, hey, did you know that you have potentially the best women's soccer team in the world practicing and getting ready for a season where you are? It was really astounding.
There's a whole nother episode, and Andy and I talked about that in our episode number 2 a little bit. But
good.
At some point, I want to get much deeper and more granular into that story. But if I remember most of that conversation correctly, some of it, frankly, was born out of the fact that the owner was more either a fan of the game, or his kids were, or it wasn't sort of the most well thought out business decision, if that's a fair statement.
Yeah, well, Dan, he was an interesting guy, and he refused to abide. But he basically didn't recognize league authority on a lot of things. Everything from the signage that you're going to use, the width of your field, uploading videos to this shared video system so that teams could scout each other. He just didn't abide by those rules, and so they were going to kick him out, and then he sued, and that was the narrative. The narrative should not be that Dan Borislow killed WPS.
By the way, I think that is the narrative that a lot of people erroneously, and I know I remember Andy sort of mentioning this, but let's explore that a little bit, because I think a bunch of people who were following it did think that he was sort of not only symptomatic, but maybe the actual reason as to why it folded.
He gave the final push, or his lawsuits gave the final push. The reason that they brought him on in the first place was because they weren't in particularly good shape. And the reason they were trying to work things out to keep him involved in the league somehow was because they didn't have enough teams. They temporarily lost their Division I sanctioning from U.S. Soccer, and they had to go back and petition and to have basically 5 teams. That's not a healthy league, lawsuit or not. I mean, they were, when if Borislav had bought the Freedom and the Freedom had gone under, they would have had 5 teams in 2011, and that's not a good look. Now, granted, the NASL bounced back from having 5 teams one year, but in the modern marketplace, if you're going to have a 5-team league, it's not a good look. So it certainly didn't help, but Borislav was to some extent a symptom rather than a cause.
Well, it's also interesting too that the WPS, was born off the success of the Olympics success in 2008, but the loss though of the Women's World Cup in 2009, if I have those numbers correct, right?
No, the next Women's World Cup was 2011.
My mistake. Sorry.
And they lost the final, but it was a fantastic final and a fantastic tournament. And when I went to WPS games after that World Cup, it was a huge boom. I mean, it was autograph lines that snaked all the way through Harvard. I mean, Andy Crossley would probably tell you that having just people lined up for autographs as far as the eye could see, because they really jumped in there. So that was one of the big tragedies for WPS, was that they were already in such bad shape that boost couldn't save them, because if it had, who knows what 2012 would have looked like. And
I get my Women's World Cup mixed up, because 2007 was the one where they came in 3rd place, and that was obviously that led into 2008 with the win and the Olympics, and then so that was certainly a good boost and not a bad thing to have sort of going into the league. But I distinctly remember there was a point in time during the course of the season. And I guess this was during the Women's World Cup, where I guess the tournament had already started or was just getting ready to get underway. And the news came that WPS would not go on after that current season. And I remember, and I have to dig for some tape and some video of this, but talk about, it's almost like a punch to the gut, right? Because here they are, the women's team, not defending their championship, but arguably the favorites, again, the prohibitive favorites, and the league, kind of still sticking around. It's almost the mixed emotions had to be very significant for most of the players that were not only on that shared both a professional gig in WPS as well as their time on the stage in the tournament.
You may be thinking of the summer of 2012. Because that's when the WPS, officially went out of business during the summer of 2012, and it would have been somewhere around the time of the Olympics, because they made it through 2011. At the end of 2011, I mean, I was at that WPS championship game, and no one knew that was going to be the last game. They actually held a draft in 2012, and they thought they were going to be able to keep going, and then they suspended the season. And not really to anyone's surprise, it was when everything was going back and forth with Borislav and U.S. Soccer, and then they suspended it, and it was sort of an afterthought when they actually said, "Yeah, we're not coming back," because most leagues that take a season off, they're not coming back. I mean, that from indoor soccer. It's just, we're just going on hiatus, but we'll retool and come back stronger. Yeah, no, you're not. It just doesn't work that way.
All right. So now I'm getting my events mixed up because, that was probably 2012, the Summer Olympics then. That's where I was probably remembering some of that, right? But regardless, though, I mean, this is now a women's U.S. national team that has spent, at this point, good 10, 15, almost 20 years essentially becoming the elite team in the world. I mean, not winning every single time, but certainly always being strong and always generally being regarded as the, if not, not only the favorite, but the sort of the odds on to win. But the demise of WPS, I mean, you don't sense that when WPS played its final game in Rochester with the Flash winning, that people on the field and off the field, they felt that they were going to come back next year with solid sort of feeling of such, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it was 100%, but people certainly didn't feel like they were at a funeral. It was a pretty nice occasion, and I think people were thinking, mean, there were positive signs here and there throughout the season, and then throughout the off season in January, they actually had a deal announced at one point. They said, well, okay, Borislav's going to field an exhibition team, and they're going to be like the Harlem Globetrotters and go play so he can have a team but not be in the league. And then the league can go on. And so they thought they had this deal, but that in reality, it simply wasn't going to work. And so that was into 2012, into January, when people still had, some inkling, some hope that it was going to go on.
So when May 2012 comes around, were you surprised that the WPS folded effectively, or were you surprised, not shocked, or were you?
Not surprised in the least. I mean, again, you go on hiatus, for a year, which WPS had. I mean, and that announcement was in January. I remember it vividly because it was, it was the one time in my life I've attempted to ski. And so I failed miserably at that, went into lunch, checked my BlackBerry at the time, and who had written me, but Dan Borislav saying, so you heard about WPS? And that was the suspension of the season. And so I never thought that they were going to come back once they suspended the season. I mean, they simply just weren't strong enough. Just like I never really thought the WUSA was going to come back. Even though they put together these exhibitions so you could see some version of the Washington Freedom playing some version of the Atlanta Beat, and nice events and so forth. But I never thought they were going to come back. I feel like once leads go away, they're gone. You don't come back from that.
Okay, well, that you could not have set the table better than with that comment, because 2012, we're looking at May, it's official now, and this is the heart of your book. It would seem that two strikes and, it would be folly, right? I think for most outside observers to even fathom the idea of trying again. But yet, the seeds of what now exists as the legitimate and arguably solidifying even further NWSL that we enjoy today were really sown, I guess, in the pieces that sort of were left over around around 2012 or so. What happened both immediately as well as sort of, in the months that followed that kind of gave people sort of reason to keep going and not to give up this quote unquote fight?
Well, a couple of people just refused to give up, and that included the people running the Boston Breakers and Western New York and Chicago Red Stars. And the Red Stars had actually dropped out of WPS and were playing amateur soccer in WPSL, but still a fairly strong organization. So those teams all said, well, we're going to keep playing. Let's see if we can put a league together. And so they worked with the WPSL, and WPSL had...
You might want to explain to WPSL, because that's to our audience who may not sort of understand the quote-unquote soccer pyramid, especially on the women's side.
Right. Well, the WPSL and the W League, not the Australian W League, but the league that was run by the USL, which is the organization that today runs the second-tier men's division, the championship, and then the third-tier League One, and then an amateur league called League Two. So the W League and the WPSL, both almost exclusively amateur. There actually was one professional team in the W League, and it was actually the forerunner of the Western New York Flash. So those leagues, the W League, they've both been around for a long time. And so the W League, especially in the 2000s, was the only thing going. And there were a handful of players who kept going in that, and in fact kind of enhanced their case to be on the national team in those days. The prime example, and she's a commentator now for NWSL games, is Lindsay, who kept playing for the Washington Freedom as an amateur and managed to stay in the game and work her way onto the team. So those leagues had already performed kind of a valuable role in keeping soccer going in the 2000s. But again, it wasn't much. So in 2012, those remaining teams, or the remnants of WPS, got together with WPSL and said, "Hey, can we take some of your strongest teams and form a league with them? We'll form a couple of new teams as well." And they wound up with 8 teams. And so you had this thing with a couple of pro teams, a bunch of amateur teams, though in some cases professionally run. And there's your league, WPSL Elite.
But now, if you look back, though, right, today's National Women's Soccer League, NWSL, actually dials itself back to being founded in 2012. So it seems like there's been a little, fuzziness or fuzzing, I guess, of names or origin, or was this kind of sort of in the process? I guess the initial season, was 2013 for the NWSL. So I guess you're describing 2012 as being somewhat of a, sort of a hodgepodge marriage by necessity, I guess, sort of keep things kind of the heart beating, so to speak.
Right. Well, the teams that had been professional teams in WPS, that's Boston, Western New York, and Chicago, were all part of the movement to launch this new league, the which became the NWSL. And there were, reports of how things were going to look over the course of the summer, and they evolved here and there. We're going to have 12 teams in this sort of setup. No, wait, we're going to have 8 in this kind of setup. But Boston, Western New York, and Chicago were going to be involved. And Sky Blue didn't play in 2012, but they came back in 2013. So there actually was a fair amount of continuity in clubs between WPS and NWSL. And, was an important thing of the 2012 summer, was that you had clubs who provided some continuity. And so, and not only the teams from WPSL, but there was a team in the W League that was DC United Women. They had a very loose affiliation with DC United, the Major League Soccer team. They wore DC United jerseys and so forth. That team became the Washington Spirit of the NWSL. Same owners, same staff, but bulked up a bit for the professional game. And those teams also made an effort to keep a lot of those players. I mean, the Chicago Red Stars, to this day, have some players who were with them in the 2012 season. So it provided some continuity, even though they were playing in WPS in 2011, WPSL Elite or the W League in 2012, and NWSL in 2013. There were some organizations that stayed intact.
A couple of things strike me here in this sort of third attempt, right? And I guess to the outsider, it seems like folly. But number one, it seems like the WPSL and then what became the NWSL. If the WPS, keep with me on the acronyms. If the WPS didn't want to repeat the profligate spending of the WUSA, right? The WPSL, soon to evolve into the NWSL, which we know today, didn't want to be the WPS in terms of their spending, right? So in many respects, the investment commitment seems to be lowering, not rising, as this third league comes about. Wise, I guess, cost controlled, sure, but arguably, is that any way to kind of get another pro league up and running? It would seem kind of head scratching to me, or maybe not, because so much money had been wasted the first 2 times.
It's kind of like, there's a classic George Carlin bit called "A Place for My Stuff," where he says, you have a house with all this stuff in it. Then you go somewhere on vacation and you take a smaller version of your house. You take all of this stuff. Then let's say you go on vacation and you meet your friend and the friend says, "Hey, let's go spend the night over at this person's place." And you take a third version so yeah, it did. It got smaller. There's like a third version of your stuff. And NWSL in its first season paid a lot of players 4-figure salaries. They were all making less than $10,000. So, I mean, it was, and of course, MLS had just come out of a long spell of paying some players barely five figures. So it wasn't that unusual. But yeah, they were. It really was dialing back the spending as much as they possibly could to get things going in the NWSL. And I think the main argument for it is that it worked, and they're still around, and they've outlived the other two leagues combined at this point.
The other thing that strikes me, though, certainly was at the outset of this, is the involvement of the United States Soccer Federation, or what's today known colloquially as U.S. Soccer. In my recollection, U.S. Soccer was sort of instrumental in at least leaning in to figure out ways, constructively perhaps, and maybe previously at arm's length, to somehow keep the women's game up and running. And arguably because there's certainly a meal ticket involved, right? And that's the women's national team, right? Which has been, outperforming, and we can get into the legalities of all of it and why they're, certainly outperforming what the men have done. But I guess the point is that this strikes me as being, if I have my research correct, kind of the first real involvement of certainly the Federation. And I guess maybe, begs the question beyond that, where was the Federation before in the first two attempts, and/or where was Major League Soccer in terms of maybe being a support? I mean, you mentioned a couple of informal things, but, you would think that could be a stabilizer in the past as well.
There were some, someone should really write a book on what was the WUSA and get into, there was essentially a bit of rivalry with MLS, and there was talk that MLS was going to do its own thing at some point. But MLS at that time really didn't have the stability to do that, and they didn't make any sort of investment in the women's game until the NWSL launched in 2013, and the one team that had a lot of resources and then drew five-figure crowds was in Portland, where the Portland Timbers started the Portland Thorns. They're the same organization, and it's almost seamless. It's like okay, who's playing this weekend? The Timbers. Okay, we're going. Who's playing this weekend? The Thorns. Okay, we're going. And so a lot of continuity there, a lot of synergy, I guess you could say. But yeah, it's worked out really well for them. In terms of U.S. Soccer, I mean, generally a federation doesn't want to try to run the league. That's not how it works in most countries. It actually kind of works that way in Australia, but I've read a little bit. I'm not an expert. I just know that it's a little bit tied together there, I believe, both on the men's and women's side. And so, U.S. Soccer said at this point, look, we need a professional women's league or we're going to fall behind. And I think that was evident. And again, we go back to Brianna Scurry in 2007 being thrown in the semifinals of the World Cup, having played only a handful of competitive games. It's because the only place she could play was on the national team, and Hope Solo played the vast majority of the games. So they needed that. They needed to develop a deeper talent pool. And for this book, I did spreadsheets where I traced where players went, and I saw. Let's take all the American players who were in the WUSA in 2003 and all the players who had been capped, some of whom were still in college in 2003. And let's see how many of them stayed in the game until WPS started in 2009. And they lost, by my count, about 100 professional players, and including maybe about 30 who had been capped. So that was devastating. They really didn't want that to happen again. In fact, you go look back, the U.S. team in 2007 and 2008, 2008, they overachieved. It was, Pia Sundhage's brilliance and a couple of people just having sort of, career summers, sort of like, Tony Stana 2002 is Angela Hucley's 2008, and that really got them through. They it was perhaps the one period where you could say the U.S. was not demonstrably the best team in the world. They were probably not as good as Brazil and probably not as good as Germany. And so they knew that they had to do something. They had to have a professional league. They had to keep players in the game. And so U.S. Soccer did step up, and they provided they essentially started it out of the Federation offices. And I went to the first NWSL draft, and it was Neil Beatty, the U.S. Soccer Communications Director, running back and forth between this conference room and this room where, the 6 of us who were covering women's soccer at the time were there anxiously awaiting the word on each draft pick. And U.S. Soccer still to this day subsidizes salaries for a specific set of players. 20-some players, depending on the year and the type of contract the type of CBA they have at the time. They pay those salaries so that the owners of the individual clubs don't have to.
Well, and that, that's not unimportant, right? That subsidization, right? And I would imagine that as the NWSL continues to get stronger, and literally this is as timely as today's headlines, and that a new franchise with some star power and some venture capital behind it now being announced in Los Angeles to bring the league up to, I guess it's 9 franchises now, essentially, gives, I guess, players and administrators a bit of hope here, right? I mean, that they can quote unquote make a living at this, because you're mentioning sort of the intestinal fortitude is the term that comes to mind. I don't know if it's the right one, but I mean, you're mentioning how many players sort of left in between the WUSA and the WPS, and I don't even know what your spreadsheet says for, the demise in early 2012 of the WPS, right? And how many sort of got so disillusioned that they gave up on the game and quote unquote, pick up the rest of their lives, so to speak, right? Because at the end of the day, being a full-time only professional women's soccer player, hell, even being a professional men's soccer player for most players in MLS, right, is still not a viable full-time job without subsidy, without endorsements, without some other or part-time job or whatever. And I think that's the dream of everybody, women, men, everybody, right, is that not only to increase and solidify the talent, for quadrennial tournaments like the Olympics and the World Cups, but also, frankly, to make it a viable, profession that actually youngsters and those with dreams can actually make a living out of this in the world of pro sports, where arguably it's overdue in this country.
Yeah, I mean, MLS went, many years losing the occasional player. I mean, there was one player who was drafted one year and didn't report because he chose to go to med school. I remember a player leaving to become a dentist. I believe Scott Garlick abruptly quit playing right before a season because he had opportunities in commercial real estate. Troy Perkins, DC United goalkeeper, had a second job at a bank. And then I remember writing a feature during my USA Today tenure, probably maybe 2007 or so, a player leaving to go to the priesthood. Although that was probably not really a financial decision. There was a lot more that went into that. So, yeah, they kept losing players there. But my spreadsheet would show many, many fewer players leaving the game, leaving women's soccer at that time. It shows a lot of players who stayed in, and some of them, have gone on to be on the national team. I highlighted a couple of players, and Ali Long, who has been on the national team now for a while. She had also played in France, but came back and played a little bit for the New York Fury in 2012. The big success story is Mccall Zerbon, who when WPS fell apart was thinking, well, I might quit now. But Western New York continued as a professional team and said, come here, come stay with us and play through 2012. And she did. And she went on to NWSL and made the national team at age, I believe, 30. So, that's a story that you couldn't have written before all this. And today you have players who have played professionally for close to a decade. I mean, there are some players in the NWSL today who can trace their professional histories all the way back to 2009. Some of them who have never been on the national team. I mean, it's one thing to stay in the game when you've been on the national team and you get national team money and you also play professionally, but the national team is really what keeps you going. There are people who've been playing professional soccer without being on the national team, for a decade now. And that is such a difference. That's such a change, especially because someone like a Mccall Zerbon might come in and challenge for a spot on the national team, which can only make that team better.
For sure. All right. Well, I want to get into sort of your vision of what this league is likely to see and experience going forward, because it's clearly on solid footing. And you mentioned the fact that it's outlasted its two predecessors and seems to be fairly stable, a relative statement in the world of COVID-19. But I want to just maybe circle back on one sort of other area. We mentioned the subsidy role that U.S. soccer has played in this, and arguably, without it, you could make the argument that it would have been harder. But I do want to just maybe underline now what in some respects almost feels like, geez, why wasn't this pursued earlier on? You mentioned a few of the reasons, but you mentioned Portland, and we certainly see in Houston with the Dash, backed by the MLS team in Houston, the Dynamo. It feels to me like MLS and the NWSL truly have some strong partnership opportunities, both now as well as going forward, and maybe being more of a nurturing partner or operational resource sharer and or subsidizer in their own way, whether it's the facilities or the training or whatever. Why now for MLS and certain pockets of involvement? And perhaps is there more collaboration to come, maybe overdue and or inevitable?
I think that they had to overcome a bit of suspicion, some mutual suspicion to reach this point. And we have to remember that back in the early 2000s, I mean, there's a book on the 1999 women's soccer team called The Girls of Summer that's been commissioned for a movie. And in that book, the author, Jerry Longman from the New York Times, is talking about, sports leagues or the women's soccer compared to men's soccer, and says, well, in soccer, the women are the NBA and the men are the WNBA. And, it was a bit short-sighted. It was a bit getting kind of kept up in the rush of 1999. But certainly women's soccer was doing quite well at that time, and perhaps figuring, we don't need the men. And also, if you look globally, it took a very long time for, clubs to catch on to where there were a lot of women's teams that were affiliated with a men's team. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And, you'd always hear horror stories out of Brazil. Our club just signed this big time men's player. We're paying him all this money, so we're going to have to cut something. Well, there goes the women's team. And so that sort of fear, has gone in there. So you had to overcome some suspicion, saying, okay, the Portland Timbers want to run a team. Well, what happens when, they have to make a hard choice on resources? Are the women necessarily going to lose out? I think that's been overcome. I mean, it's still a little questionable. I mean, Houston and Orlando are, you'd have to say, a mixed bag. There are good reports out of there and some not so good reports out of there. It seems to be working pretty well in Utah, which is hosting the NWSL's bubble tournament right now.
Yeah, the first pro league really to come back to action in the United States.
It was the first professional league to come back into action, and they've had this bubble that worked pretty well, except for the fact that they had to turn away a team that was the Orlando team that had some positive tests and some questionable quarantine behavior. And so they, just like MLS had a couple of teams that haven't been able to participate because of positive tests and so forth. The NWSL had one, but the Utah Royals, affiliated with Real Salt Lake, have hosted this tournament. The They've played some games at the Real Monarch Stadium. They're playing the last games at I forget the name of it now. It used to be the Riot, the great stadium in Sandy, Utah. Yeah, it used to be called Rio Tinto. They have another sponsor now.
Yeah.
I can't remember who it is.
Always be Rio Tinto to me, just because that was what they had in the beginning.
Well, it's the Riot. That's what they call it. It was in the song, here at the Riot, and also, the North Carolina Courage are affiliated with the USL team, the North Carolina FC, and the Courage have been the dominant team. It was the Western New York Flash, and they finally kind of gave up the ghost in Western New York, sold the team, and they moved to North Carolina, and has been the dominant team of the last 3 or 4 years in the NWSL. So now those partnerships are working, and the new team in Los Angeles it's not officially going to be part of LAFC, but you have at least one fairly prominent owner involved with both, and it's Mia Hamm. So there'll probably be some interplay between LAFC and this new Los Angeles team. It just took a while for that trust to build. And
it would also the theme that I think that financially too, there seems to be movement in the game generally and sports overall too around maybe entertaining venture or private equity investments versus families or consortium of investors. The notion of owning and or operating or running multiple teams as Red Bull does and a number of other entities, it seems, both across the pond and here, and maybe perhaps that becomes a bit of sort of a again, a shared services thing, right? We've seen pro leagues and teams, the Lamar Hunts of the world, right, where you sort of take all of your various entities, or what Ted Leonsis does in Washington, right? It becomes actually a strength because you have the same resources that essentially become the backing for 1, 2, 3, or 4 different entities, necessitating or sort of eliminating, frankly, the need for replicating of efforts and stuff. But I think it's also interesting as well, not just financially, but and perhaps uniquely in this case, and maybe this is sort of my second to last question. We mentioned sort of arguably the saving graces, I guess, of U.S. soccer's involvement back in 2012 to kind of get conversations and or some resources behind sort of, if you will, saving the women's pro game here. But that relationship between the women's players is certainly strained since then, right? And then some. The role of U.S. soccer is not necessarily, shall we say, strong and or warm and fuzzy as it was maybe back then when they kind of kept things together. Do you see that U.S. soccer and this NWSL, I don't want to say they're on a collision course, but how do you, it seems to me like this is the place where the tensions expressed by the women's World Cup teams and their desire for equal and then some pay may sadly kind of, be found on a more, persistent basis because of its professional nature.
Yeah. Well, it has been at times a contentious relationship, and I urge people to read Caitlin Murray's book on the history of the U.S. women's team. And, after the 1999 World Cup, there were certainly different visions on what to do next. And then, it was Julie Foudy and a few other players who took kind of a hard line and said, no, we need to do things this way. And there was actually, at one point, they did have replacement players go to, a friendly tournament at one point in 2000. And, they were threatening, all sorts of action then. Then the interesting thing is that a collective bargaining agreement that the women signed back in the mid-2000s when they had no leverage at all. It kept going through 2012. They did not negotiate a full-fledged new CBA leading at the end of 2012 into 2013. They came up with what they called a memorandum of understanding that basically just took the previous CBA and shoved it forward with new numbers. that is the root of the problem, because that deal was not that good. And so if you go back and start digging, 5 years into the past, the memorandum of understanding went through the end of 2016, and the lawsuit that we have now is the carryover from, first of all, a strike threat, and then a petition to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in 2016 before the Olympics. And so they went to the EEOC, and you can't sue while you're going through the EEOC. The EEOC finally, after a couple of years, issued what's called a right to sue, and that's when the lawsuit was filed. So it really stems back. The current women's collective bargaining agreement still has a couple of holes in it, and part of it had to do with the fact that things got really contentious. This Hope Solo brought in this kind of barracuda of a lawyer, Rich Nichols, and then they eventually fired him, and some of the clauses in that CBA just look kind of petty. And so, if you're going to pay, this amount to the men's team if they lose a friendly, well, we're going to pay just a little bit less to the women if they lose a friendly. There are some apples to apples things in there that aren't very good. It's generally difficult to compare the deals, just because, first of all, the women are far more likely to win a World Cup than the men. If the men won, then it's sort of like everyone just sort of sign blank checks and who knows what would happen, and worry about it later, just because it would just be this astounding moment. Whereas the women, you don't want to say routinely win it, but they win it a lot. And so, but the current collective bargaining agreement, U.S. Soccer had a fairly winning argument, which is that we sent over the course of the new collective bargaining agreement have paid the women more than we paid the men. And yes, it's due in part to an unlikely series of events, including the U.S. men not qualifying. But of course, if the U.S. men had qualified, their revenue would have been so much better. So it's not the current collective bargaining agreement didn't prompt the lawsuit. It was the old one. And it's what they signed in 2005 when they had no leverage at all. And then what the CBA 1.1 that they signed in 2013, where they didn't. It wasn't much better than the old one.
I guess the question in there is: do you think the NWSL could get sidetracked or distracted or otherwise by this still festering issue between U.S. Soccer and the women players?
At this point, I don't think so. And part of it has to do with, I don't think it would have been an issue under Carlos Cordero. It just doesn't seem likely, because I think, he had been vice president before he was president and understood the importance of this league. And of course, now, since Cordero has left, the president is Cindy Cone, formerly Cindy Parlow, Hall of Fame women's soccer player.
And not insignificantly, a woman, which could be arguably partially the, forward-leaning solution going forward, that could be more helpful than hurtful, for sure.
Right. And, she isn't going to give the women every dollar they've asked for, because unfortunately for the women's national team lawyers, Cindy Cone can also do math. And she knows that if you paid every cent that the women are looking for, which basically is predicated on the notion of, paying women the same World Cup bonus that the men would have gotten, even though the FIFA prize money has such a wide disparity. The women got $2 million in 2015, $4 million in 2019, whereas the men, I remember the 2018 figure off the top of my head. France got $38 million. So,
order of magnitude.
Right. So what the women are asking for right now is essentially, 600% to 1,000% of the FIFA prize money that U.S. soccer got. And you could have said a couple of years ago, well, U.S. soccer is sitting on $150 million pile of assets. Well, they got a lot of that from the Copa America Centenario, and they're trying to spend that money on making things better down the road. Because here's the little thing that a lot of people don't notice: the U.S. women in youth international tournaments are not doing well right now. They have not done well for the last, we'll say, 6 to 8 years. So developmentally, we're falling behind. Every other country is starting to catch up, and to some extent, you want that to happen. I mean, there aren't any. No one who's involved with women's soccer wants the game to be weak in Germany or England or Brazil or any place else. It's good to have competition. You don't want it to be like women's softball, where it was just the U.S. and Japan every year, and they finally cut it from the Olympics. They've since reinstated it, but that's they want women's soccer to thrive internationally at will, but that means it's a challenge to spend on development. So the question you end up with is, do you want money to go into better programs, better coaching education, so that youth players, boys and girls, are getting good soccer experience and building for the future? Or do you want to go back retroactively under the set of circumstances no one could have predicted, which is that the women would ask for $25 million bonus for against $2 million prize money, and say, oh, well, here you go, Megan Rapinoe. Take your money and build a nice beach house, I guess. And sorry, we're going to have to cut all our coaching education programs.
Well, that's a really good point, because and that's where I guess the final question comes into play, right? The role of NWSL going forward, right? Because that developmental infrastructure, right, that needs to be is probably more important than ever as, to your point, other countries, quote unquote, catch up to us. I mean, it's ironic that as, we talk about soccer in the United States, it's actually been the case with the United States being the leader in the world in the women's game, right? And now, like we're still trying to do on the men's side, other countries catching up. And arguably now is the time where you need to strengthen, and it are not so arguably cements the notion that a stable and hopefully successful professional league needs to be part of that infrastructure, and God forbid gives the youth that are training and are hopefully improving in competition something to strive for, God forbid, with a paying wage and a career, at least period of time, salary scenario that makes it worth their while and they aspire to, versus nothing being sort of at the end of the rainbow except for a quadrennial event that may or may not pay them, by the way, equally or then some. So the question wrapped up in there is, as the sort of final query is, what do you see the NWSL becoming in the years to come? What do you think its future is, COVID-19 notwithstanding, right? So let's take that out of the equation. That's obviously a big hit for anything in pro sports generally. But how do you think the NWSL, assuming all things being equal, how do you feel its position is and women's pro soccer this time around going forward? Fairly strong? No?
I think so. And if you look at the MLS trajectory, it was first there was they blew their expectations out of the water in the first season, and then dropped, and then bad circumstances in 2001 and nearly dropping out. But really the model that they intended to follow from the start and redoubled on in 2002 was slow growth. It's like, hey, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's build up. We're going to gradually pay players more and so forth. And then you start to hit a tipping point, or you hit several tipping points. And, having the confidence to go out and sign David Beckham while he was still relatively young, a little bit past his peak, but, not 38. And then you have this explosion in new teams. You have all that's being spent on incoming players. I mean, this didn't get much publicity, but the Atlanta United went down and bought pretty much the best player in South America, and Pity Martinez, and they So that the question is, has the NWSL hit that tipping point now? And what does that look like? Now, the ratings for the first game of this Challenge Cup that they're doing, this abbreviated season, were through the roof. I mean, it's 500-some thousand, which would be considered very good for MLS and good for Premier League broadcast in the U.S. as well. There, you could have the question of whether some of that was the novelty factor, of the fact that, hey, we can finally watch a live sport. But I think it does show how seriously people do take women's soccer at this point. That it wasn't I don't know if you know this, but the Pro Pickleball Association is also back in action. It did not get 500,000 viewers on CBS the way the NWSL did. So I don't think that the NWSL is suddenly going to become the equivalent of MLS. We've yet to see that happen. It's a strange thing with women's sports where we can see that in individual sports, right? I mean, there's not much different. Who's the most famous tennis player in the U.S. right now? It's Serena Williams. Who was the most famous skier in the U.S. for a long time? Probably the most famous skier in the world, actually, is Lindsay and then Mickaela Shiffrin. And those sports don't really distinguish that much between men and women. They're in terms of the resources. I mean, sometimes they do, but in a lot of cases, they're fairly even. We've yet to see that happen with team sports. At least
you can make the argument WNBA is still very much a subsidy of the NBA, despite lots of opportunities and successes, but still very much in the shadow. But yet it's been around for 20 years, right? So that's saying absolutely something. But, I think many investors would have thought it would have been bigger by now and maybe more standalone capable by now too. So maybe there's something constructive there.
One thing you can say about the WNBA is that it's bigger than the Women's Basketball World Championship. Maybe not bigger than the Olympics, but the Women's Basketball World Championship, no one knows that. But people still know who Sue Bird is, even aside from the fact that she's now with Megan Rapinoe. People know who Elena Delle Donne is. The WNBA champion Washington Mystics, you mentioned Ted Leonsis earlier. Leonsis got a ring with the Mystics and with the Capitals. So at least WNBA players can be known. Soccer is a little different just because the NWSL players that are going to be household names are also are household names from the World Cup and not necessarily the NWSL. But I think the NWSL can be bigger than the WNBA if it isn't already. I think it could be something that right now only one team in the league averages more than 10,000 per game, and that's in Portland. I could see it getting to where there are multiple teams that average 10,000 and see it getting, maybe not 500,000 every game, but maybe 250,000, which sustained MLS for a long time. It was enough that MLS was able to demand a rights fee. It didn't demand a rights fee at the beginning, but now it does. So I think that's the foreseeable future, and I think it looks pretty bright. I think that I think people have a little bit of a long enough memory that if we can all get back to normal next year, and the NWSL can play a regular season, you'll also have the hype of going into the Olympics if the Olympics happen. But I do think women's soccer has made enough of an impression now that. Again, I said that, I said earlier that it feels different this time. And I think part of it had to do with, if you watch the attendance at NWSL games after the World Cup, they got that boost, but then they sustained that boost better than we've seen in the past. So I think you're going to see it stronger than it has been. And right now it's solid. I think they're going to go from solid to strong would be the best way I would put it.
Well, so let's put a push pin in this, and let's revisit this if you're willing in your game in perhaps the fall of next year, if there is indeed a Summer Olympics, and there is hopefully a women's a women's gold medal for the United States in that competition. And at the very least, let's also soft circle 2023, right, which is when the next Women's World Cup in Australia and New Zealand, we think and hope, because I would argue that that's going to also be a good benchmark for how successful and, frankly, how much of a contribution to the development and all those other things that we talked about earlier, hopefully shows continued strength in the U.S.'s performance in that tournament as well.
Yeah, it's hard to say because, we're getting to where with women's soccer competitions, it's kind of like the NCAA. If you look at the NCAA basketball tournament, the favorite in a given year, the odds are never better than maybe 3-1, because there's so many teams that can win it. I thought the U.S. was the best team in the 2019 tournament, in the 2019 Women's World Cup. They were also lucky. They got a couple of honestly bad calls in their favor that helped them, and they also got a free kick from Megan Rapinoe that was well struck, but just kind of managed to sneak through and take an odd bounce, and that affected the course of that game. So, you're going to need a bit, and you could argue that it was the opposite in 2016 when the U.S. Was eliminated before the semifinals for the first time ever. First time the women hadn't been on a podium at either the World Cup or the Olympics. So, it's one of those things where 2021, a bad bounce here and they could be out in the quarterfinals again. It's kind of like the last Spinal Tap drummer said, the law of averages, should dictate that eventually a Spinal Tap drummer is going to survive. And eventually the U.S. is going to lose again. And it could be that in a couple of years, by 2023, they might not be the best team in the world. They're a pretty old team right now. And again, you look at youth soccer tournaments, youth international tournaments around the world right now. It's going to be a challenge. It's going to be fun to watch.
All right, our thanks to Beau. Fascinating stuff. So much more to uncover. The WUSA continues to fascinate me. God forbid we'll have some folks who are directly involved with that. I'd love to have John Hendricks on, for example. He of Discovery Network's founding fame and the chief funder and cheerleader for the original attempt at pro soccer for the women in this country with the WUSA. WPS is fascinating to me. I'd love to have folks involved there too. Tanya Antonucci, former colleague of mine from my professional life back in the day, amongst many others, and various intrigue there, Magic Jack being one of them. That franchise alone is worth an episode. And we look forward to delving into those and, of course, rooting for the continued success and stability of the NWSL as they complete their Champions Cup. Excuse me, the Challenge Cup. Sorry, I got to get that straight. In the days ahead here, it actually may be done by the time we've dropped this episode. But all of that is all part of the tableau of history of soccer in this country, women's sports and women's soccer in this country, for sure, and lots more stories to come. You want to read some of Beau's work? Well, of course, we're going to tell you how to do that. First, how about his website, Dure Sport, DURESPORT, all one word, duresport.com, duresport.com. That's where all of his books and blog postings and other stuff, his social media feeds and all that kind of stuff can be found there. And of course, we have links to some of his books that are relevant to this week's conversation. Just search up this episode on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, number 174, if you're counting at home. And links to the following will be found. 2012, the year that saved women's soccer, is available in paperback and ebook forms there. You will find a link to Enduring Spirit, Beau's work on his embed of his days with the Washington Spirit and the story behind that team. Not necessarily successful on the field that year, but revealing nonetheless. you'll find his book, Why the U.S. Men Will Never Win the World Cup. Fighting words, those, but, it's certainly provocative and not unexpected. And frankly, as you heard him reference in our conversation, researched and based on his findings from his reporting over the years, as well as a book that I highly recommend. The only real, I guess, independent analysis and or history of Major League Soccer thus far, arguably not completely up to date because it was written, almost 10 years ago now, but it's a really good synopsis and a dig into the founding and the running of the earliest days and years of Major League Soccer. It's called Long Range Goals, the Success Story of Major League Soccer. All those and more from Beau Dure, available for you for purchase, and we highly recommend all of those and then some. We want to remind you that, of course, on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, you will find our social media links, but you could also go and subscribe to those directly. How about at Twitter? You'll find us at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. You will find a little web page devoted to us on Facebook as well. You can send us email from a link on our website, but also directly. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And you can also find a convenient link on the site to subscribe to our weekly newsletter as well. All that stuff waiting for you there at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Thank you, of course, as always. You know him, you love him, you can't live without him. His name is Jerry Payne. Take a bow, sir, wherever you might be. And we thank you and his Jerry Payne Audio Excellence for their doings this week to get this show up and out there into the ether. We appreciate to no end you listening. Hey, if you see a chance to rate and review this show, by all means, we'd love to have you, especially those 5-star ratings. Do that early and often, why don't you? And tell your friends. And until next week, we will bid you a fond adieu. Thanks for listening, everybody. And please take care of yourselves. And we'll look to see you next week. Bye-bye.